right, well, good evening, friends. Great to see y'all here. Sorry, I'm going to crack this open here real quick. Rebecca went and had coffee with a friend this afternoon, and I was left at home all by myself dealing with my savage children. And by dealing with them, I mean I took a nap while they played video games. And she didn't bring me back a coffee, so I'm forced to resort to this Dr. Pepper. So y'all can feel bad for me in that way. Well, you should know by now the things, So anyway, what's that? That's beside the point. So, all right. Well, tonight, friends, we are going to continue, of course, in our discussion on Baptist history. If you remember, just real quickly as a recap, last week we kind of moved from the experience of Baptists in New England. This is, of course, during the American colonial period. We moved from the experience of Baptists in New England. If you remember, New England Baptists there, particularly Massachusetts, Rhode Island, to name two kind of hot spots that we talked about. Baptist congregations are kind of growing in kind of fits and starts. Of course, you have the foundation of the Rhode Island colony and religious liberty there. Baptist churches are growing fairly steadily there in Rhode Island, and we eventually have the founding of the first Baptist college there in Providence, kind of co-founded by Baptists of Rhode Island, but also Baptists in Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia Baptist Association specifically. But in general, the Baptist experience in New England is one of persecution, one of kind of a religious minority, kind of on the fringes of respectable society. But last Sunday, we talked primarily about Baptists in the middle colonies, especially in places like Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, New Jersey, have a little bit of a different experience, primarily because the religious context is different there in the middle colonies. We talked about how because the middle colonies are settled by more of a national mix. So yes, obviously you have English settlers, but you also have Dutch and German settlers there as well in the middle colonies. Because of that, you have a significantly more diverse kind of religious landscape there in the middle colonies. And so because of that, most of the middle colonies, particularly, again, Pennsylvania, you see significantly more lax restrictions, state restrictions and state regulations on religion in those middle colonies. So because of that, you get situations like the Philadelphia Baptist Association, right? So this is the first kind of what we would think of as a local, kind of a little bit more of a regional, but the first local or regional association in the United States that's formulating they are writing a statement of faith, the Philadelphia Confession of Faith, which is essentially the Second London Baptist Confession, just with a couple extra articles added there at the end. They provide much of the money and some of the initial trustees for the founding of the first Baptist college there in Providence, Rhode Island, what eventually becomes Brown University. And so if you want to kind of compare and contrast, in New England, we see, again, kind of relatively small, kind of more underground churches outside of Rhode Island, Baptist churches in New England, whereas in the middle colonies, they're more public, more open, typically thriving more, and even beginning to associate openly. So again, the Philadelphia Baptist Association, but also building institutions. So we kind of ended last time, and we'll pick up on this theme a little bit when we kind of summarize these three regions here in a minute. But wherever we see a situation in the colonial period where Baptists are able to worship and organize and evangelize and plant churches without significant kind of government pressure, what we see Baptists doing is two things, and it's the same thing we saw them doing in Britain. It's the same thing we see them doing in the colonial period, and honestly, it's the same thing we're going to continue to see them doing throughout the American experience, and that is to associate with other local churches and to be confessional, right? These are two consistent themes, not universal themes, but consistent themes of Baptists, both in the English experience and in the American experience, that we associate, sometimes locally. Eventually, we'll start getting into state and national association organizations, particularly once we get into the 1800s. And then we also have, particularly as local churches become more associational, those associations often develop statements of faith, like Philadelphia Baptist Association. We'll see eventually, once we get into the 1800s, probably not tonight, but next week we'll talk about the New Hampshire Baptist Confession. So one area, so this kind of summarizing where we've been the last couple weeks. One region that we haven't talked about a lot yet is the South, right? So again, three kind of colonial era regions. We have New England, we have the Middle Colonies, and then we have the Southern Colonies. So there's honestly not a lot to talk about in the South, right? So today, when we think of Baptists, oftentimes we think of the South, right? But the reality is, in the 1700s especially, even into the early 1800s, Baptists weren't that common in the South, and a lot of that just has to do with there just weren't a lot of people in the South, right? We think of the South as it kind of in our own context, or at least the context of the last 100 years or so, where the South is becoming increasingly more populous, increasingly more people, more industrialized. But from the colonial period really all the way until after the Civil War, the South is significantly less populated than the Northeast and even the early Midwest. Obviously significantly less industrialized, these sorts of things. So there is kind of a continuing Baptist experience even in the colonial period in the South. It's just, it has a significantly smaller footprint, right? So the main thing that we want to think about when we think about Baptists in the Southern colonies, that's the beginnings of the First Baptist Church in Charleston, South Carolina. So this is kind of the mother church in many ways of Baptist churches in the South. If you remember, that church comes from, actually it's a transplanted New England church, right? The Kittery Church that was started in Maine, which was itself a plant from Boston, from the First Baptist Church there in Boston. They plant a church in Kittery, Maine. That church, after a few years, moves from Maine down to the Southern colonies and sets up there in Charleston in 1696. And eventually, that becomes the First Baptist Church of Charleston. And again, the main reason I bring up this church is because many of the oldest, more established churches in the South. Now, we're going to talk about an event that kind of shakes this up a little bit, the First and Second Great Awakening. But many of the older, more established churches in the South find kind of they can kind of trace their family tree to the First Baptist Church of Charleston. Charleston itself and the association that eventually builds around it, so kind of the early association of churches in the South form around First Baptist Charleston. Charleston itself adopts the 1689 London Baptist Confession as their statement of faith. And so many of the churches in the South, though not all, do likewise. So, before we dig into the Great Awakening, again, I want us to think about just a couple big picture things, some overall trends of Baptists, American Baptists in the 17th century, so the 1600s, right? So, big trends. We could probably look at about 4 different things. So, first of all, people typically became Baptists in America, right? So what I mean by that is the earliest Baptists, many of them, not all of them. So Roger Williams is a good example of one that's not this way. But many of the earliest Baptist congregations are not transplant congregations, right? So what I mean by that, they're not situations where you have a Baptist church in England and they just decide to all get on a ship one day like the Pilgrims. There's not really Baptist pilgrims where they just all kind of get on a ship one day and come over the Atlantic and set up a new, church. They change their church address to the Virginia colony or the Massachusetts colony. You may have 2 or 3, individuals that come over that way, but generally speaking, you have situations where people come to Baptist theological convictions in already established groups in the colonies, like the Congregationalists particularly, but also other kind of non-conforming separatist kind of groups within the middle colonies and others. And so in other words, Baptists in America oftentimes are, for lack of a better expression, homegrown, right? Not many transplants, not many kind of whole congregations moving over. So people typically became Baptists in America in terms of American Baptists. Second, persecution, right? Now, this is on a spectrum, of course, right? But generally speaking, outside of a few of the middle colonies and maybe Rhode Island, Baptists in the 17th century, in the 1600s, are a religious minority on the edges, kind of on the fringes of polite society, right? And a lot of this has to do with Baptist convictions, theological convictions on the nature of the church, the nature of the state, baptism, these sorts of things. Because when one of the things that makes you a Baptist is the reality that, well, only people that profess faith, verbally profess faith in Jesus Christ, who repent and believe, are members of the church, right? Once they are baptized and they are members of the church. When you're in a kind of religious, civic context that assumes kind of your baptism into your church is your entrance into citizenship, Baptists separate church membership and political citizenship in a way that was unfamiliar to the norms of the other colonies, right? So Baptists either found themselves on the margins or outright persecuted in many, if not most, of the colonial contexts, right? So kind of homegrown Baptist persecution. Second, we kind of already talked about this, so I'll go through this quick, and that's confessional and associational, right? And we've been kind of tracing this slowly but surely, talking about the historicity of confessionalism, both in English Baptists and American Baptists. We also have these early associations developing for missions and evangelism work, not only within the American colonies and this is one thing we have trouble kind of sometimes wrapping our minds around. But remember the story I told you about Elias Keach, right? He was converted from his own sermon that he probably stole from his dad, right? So how do they talk about Elias Keach? They talked about Elias Keach as like a missionary, like an apostle. Like he went out into the wilderness of New Jersey and started planting Baptist churches, right? One of the things you have to remember, the frontier, the wilderness, right, was like the middle of Pennsylvania, like the middle of Virginia, the middle of what we think of as North Carolina, like the uncharted lands, what we think of as like going to the deepest jungles of South America or Africa. That was, Ohio. At this point, right? And so in many rural ways, particularly amongst the Native Americans, the mission field is there. And we didn't even really get a chance to talk about it, but much. But you also have Baptists contributing to the beginning of the modern missions movement. And many of the earliest associations that Baptists form is not just for mutual edification, mutual protection, even mutual accountability in theological confessions. But many, if not most, of the earliest associations that Baptists formed are for the sake of missions work, be it, they didn't quite have the same categories that we do as like national and international missions, but, missions at home and missions abroad, right? Many of the earliest Baptist churches are associating for this exact same reason. Does that make sense? So we kind of see this going over and over and over again, right? The other kind of characteristic of Baptists in the 17th century that we need to make sure we kind of take away from this, because this is one big one that's about to change as we get into the 1700s and into the 1800s, is one of the things that we see in the 1600s is a relatively slow growth of Baptists within the 16th century, in the 1700s. Now, any growth obviously is a miracle of God, because everything is like the entire culture is kind of stacked against Baptists in much of the colonies. But relatively speaking, especially compared to the way Baptists grew in England during roughly the same time, you have relatively slow growth. So, for instance, in 1700, and again, these are big estimate numbers, But in 1700, you're looking at about 24 Baptist churches in America, in the North American colonies, about 24. Now, by 1795, by the end of the century, you're looking at about 1,000. Now, that's a lot. Don't get me wrong, right? But that's still not that's nowhere near the level of growth that we're going to see in the next century, right? In the kind of late 1700s to the late 1800s, these numbers are like a drop in the bucket. Does that make sense? So, again, Baptists in America, typically kind of homegrown, often face persecution, were confessional and associational, but experienced relatively slow growth, at least until we get to the First Great Awakening, okay? So, what my intention there was kind of recapping Baptists in this kind of colonial era. Now, the next phase of the Baptist story in America really begins with what we call the First Great Awakening. Now, how many of you have heard that term before? First Great Awakening. So, many of you may be pretty familiar with it. A lot of things that we could say about it. Honestly, we could do a whole class on that. I'm not really going to talk about the First Great Awakening or the Great Awakenings or the Great Awakening, depending on how you look at it. Historians are a lot like Baptists, right? You get two historians, there's three opinions. And so historians often kind of ping pong and argue a lot about the Great Awakening. So are there two? Right? So we often talk about the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening. Some think of it as just kind of one kind of mass revival movement in the Anglosphere, and Anglosphere just means England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and then of course the British colonies in North America, and then it eventually gets into Australia as well. So British Dominion, if you will. But sometimes you can think about it as kind of one big movement that just kind of gets a little hiccup here in the late 1700s. Anybody know what we call that hiccup? U.S. War of Independence, right? So that's kind of a lot of times the dividing line between the First Great Awakening and the Second Great. And again, we can't even really agree on the dates of when does the First Great Awakening begin, when does it end, when does the first one begin, when does the second one begin. But before I get into that debate, it's a historian thing. We have to have reasons to write things so we can get paid by schools. So let me get into what it is, right? So what is the Great Awakening? Because the Great Awakenings, first and second, regardless of what they are, create or regardless of how many of them there are, I should say, create a new religious context in the American colonies and what becomes the early republic of the United States of America. It's almost like when I was a kid, I played Nintendo a lot. And so I always think of sometimes I kind of wish I had, like a reset button. Like I did when I was doing bad on a video game. I could just hit the reset button and start over, So in a lot of ways, the Great Awakenings was essentially kind of almost like a reset button in a lot of ways in the religious landscape. And I'm going to kind of condense this, obviously, to the American experience, but was a bit of a reset button. It reset the stage. It reset the landscape, the religious landscape of, again, the late British colonies or the early American Republic, depending on kind of when we're talking about. So what is it, right? What is the First Great Awakening? So again, a lot more can be said. I'm going to hit this with a very broad brush. I'm going to take what you could do probably in a 16-week class over at HLG, and I'm going to try to talk about it in about 10 minutes. So what is it? So again, remember the religious landscape at the time of the colonies, right? Almost all of the colonies have state-established churches, right? For most people in the American colonies, you are born to a family, you are baptized as a baby, either into Congregational church or maybe an Anglican church. Those are just the two biggest groups. And similarly, that's kind of your entrance into the political life and into the political membership of that particular colony, right? And so religion, Christianity, for many of these people, not all of them, but for many of these people is just kind of an assumption, right? In the same way, like you would say, you know, I'm a man or a woman of Massachusetts, would be the same as saying, well, then you're obviously a part of the Congregationalist church, right? That's why Baptists were just considered weirdos, you know, or dangerous, depending on how you define them, right? And so what that inevitably breeds, right, in any context we've ever seen historically, in the history of Christianity, particularly when you have a state church that automatically absorbs its membership just by fact of being born, right? Which is most of them. Most state churches have that infant baptism set up. What you find is Christianity is not so much about your faith or your belief or relationship with Jesus. It's just part of who you are as, you know, as we would think of it, like as an American or as a Massachusettsian, if that's a word it is now, right? Or as a Pennsylvanian, right? It's just part of who you are. It's kind of almost like in the background of your cultural makeup. And so you may have never read the Bible. You may have never looked at the Bible. You may not even think really much about Jesus and that, well, you say he kind of exists and that's nice, you know, and, you know, sure, God's out there and probably the Bible is true and let's just go about my business, right? It's just kind of part of who you are culturally, right? Today we would call that kind of cultural Christianity. You guys probably know a lot of people that are like that, right? They're born here in the Midwest, they're born in the South where everybody's a Christian, whether you want to be or not. And, you know, they grew up going to church when they were a kid, and they maybe were baptized or don't, maybe not as an infant, but as a young child or a teenager, but they didn't really mean it. They were just kind of going through the motions. This might even be your story, I don't know. And then they get out on their own and they just go about their business as if none of that ever mattered, right? You get what I'm saying, right? In the colonial period, again, people don't change. People are people, no matter what time, no matter what place. But in a state church context, this is even more disruptive and more dangerous, really, I think, because it's not only ingrained into religious kind of passive culture, it's ingrained into the active culture of civil participation as well. And so what happens over the course of, as we get into the 1700s, now, again, we can't even really agree on when this starts. It doesn't really start in the same way when you flip a switch, the lights come on, and so you could say the lights came on at this point. It's more like, when did the water start boiling, right? Does it boil when the little bubbles are at the bottom of the pan, or is it boiling when everything's, you know, boiling at the top? It's more like that kind of question. Does that make sense? So what happens is, as we get into the 1700s, you get Christianity is just kind of in the cultural background. You have a lot of cultural Christians, a lot of people that are just they're Christian in a purely cultural sense. They have maybe something akin to a Christian worldview. They've got some Christian moral norms, but they don't have what we would call like a relationship with Jesus, right? And then you have an external, let's just call it a predator, right? A predator comes in. And like any human experience, whenever a predator comes in, it's fight or flight, right? And so this predator, as I like to call it, is what we call the Enlightenment, right? So the Enlightenment, and again, this is a lot of stuff, but essentially what the Enlightenment is, it's a new way of seeing the world that originates primarily in Europe. Here's a shocker, in France. But primarily in Europe, right? And the Enlightenment starts off rather innocently in a lot of ways, but eventually develops into a philosophy, really a worldview, a way of seeing the world where religion is either on the sidelines or non-existent. Enlightenment allows people to live a life, to see the world around them without really thinking about God at all. That the world is just a bunch of series of natural processes, right? Science and reason is kind of deified in some sense above special revelation, okay? So when the Enlightenment begins kind of seeping into the worldview of Europe and then thereby into the American colonies, what begins to happen is what little kind of shred of connection many people had to the church just kind of poof. Because now there's an alternative, right? Now there's where before there was only Coke, and then somebody brings Pepsi. Now, who would take Pepsi over Coke? As a barbarian. But so all you've ever had is Coke, and then somebody gives you a Pepsi, and you're like, ooh, something new, right? The Enlightenment provides a new worldview. And so for many, particularly amongst the elite and the educated in the colonies, the Enlightenment provides a way to become even more complacent with their Christianity, to set what little shred of kind of just basic Christian presupposition worldview, kind of set it aside and even ignore church, forget church altogether, and where religion is not really a part of their life. And in fact, they try to kind of reason themselves out of the crazy things they read in the Bible, like Jesus is God, right? And miracles and these sorts of things. Does that make sense? So that's why, now this is earlier, but that's why when you get to, let's say when we get to the War of Independence, this is why you have guys like Benjamin Franklin, right? So if you don't know anything about Benjamin Franklin is like the Enlightenment hero of the independence story. And I use hero in a very loose word. There's nothing heroic about Benjamin Franklin. Don't get me started. But Franklin is this Enlightenment figure. He kind of, he believes in God, but in kind of a deistic, kind of clockmaker sort of way. Pastor Anthony was talking about that a few weeks ago. He doesn't believe in the miraculous, doesn't believe that Jesus was God, doesn't believe in the Trinity, and this is all kind of because of the Enlightenment. And so what the Enlightenment does is it kind of deadens an already dead kind of Christian cultural landscape in many of the colonies, okay? Now, the Enlightenment's like a predator. You either fight or flight. And so some flee into kind of pure rationalism, like a Benjamin Franklin, but others try to fight it, right? And what they do is, in trying to fight the Enlightenment, you have men like Jonathan Edwards, right? Men like the Wesleys coming out of Anglicanism, Edwards coming out of Congregationalism. You have men like George Whitefield, also coming out of Anglicanism, Church of England. You have men that begin to push back against the Enlightenment and begin to begin to preach and teach both publicly and sometimes, like Jonathan Edwards, more in kind of a bookish, kind of a theological sort of way, begin to preach and teach about the importance, the necessity of not just cultural Christianity, but Christianity as a personal, individual experience, right? So when we say things like, I have a personal relationship with Jesus, right? Now, those theological categories are in the Bible, right? Don't misunderstand me. But that kind of language wasn't often emphasized until events like the Great Awakening, right? You don't hear similar terminology, right? Now it's there, again, in Scripture, it's there in much of the early church, but it's the revivalists, it's these early kind of new lights. I'm going to explain what I mean by old lights and new lights. It's these early new lights of the First Great Awakening that begin to talk about the necessity of a personal conversion, right? When we talk about getting saved. Now, again, I'm not saying that happened for the first time. Like the first person to ever get saved was in the First Great Awakening, but really the first time in the American experience and the English experience where we really kind of use that language and talk about it is within the First Great Awakening. Because, again, if you're operating in a church tradition that has infant baptism, right, in some sense, they would say, now not in a complete sense, but in some sense, you're saved, or at least you're taking your first steps towards salvation, even as a baby, before you even want to, in some sense, through infant baptism, right? And so this revivalism begins to kind of enter into the Christian culture of the English-speaking world, both in England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, all to greater and lesser degrees, but also into the colonies. And it basically forces, at least, especially in America, but we see this in England as well, it forces kind of, shocker, division, right? And so you get, within the First Great Awakening, you get these two groups, old lights and new lights. And old lights just means not the ones that are abandoning Christianity for the Enlightenment, but people who are continuing to see their Christianity primarily as a cultural experience, right? Primarily as a public or community experience versus an individual experience, right? Whereas the new lights, their religion, right, their experience with Christ is oftentimes spoken of in very personal, very individualistic kind of terms. And so what happens over time is that the First Great Awakening begins to develop what we would today call kind of like evangelicalism, right? If you've ever heard that term like in the news, or if you've ever heard that term talked about before, evangelicalism is certain theological presuppositions like personal saving faith, the importance and primacy of the Bible, these sorts of things. And you have these common theological beliefs and common theological experiences that transcend denomination. So you'll have evangelical Congregationalists, you'll have evangelical Anglicans, and you'll have evangelical Quakers, and even the smaller, more non-conforming groups. So in other words, what begins to happen is you have a group that wants to kind of keep on keeping on. If we just continue to do our same thing every day and we continue to be faithful to our traditions, then everything will be fine. And then you have this, again, I'm hoping you're getting the picture of the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? And then you get these young, new, radical firebrands, right, who are all about excitement and energy, and these big kind of, we think of these as almost old-fashioned now, but in the Great Awakening, these newfangled things called revivals, right, where a bunch of people from a bunch of churches, from a bunch of different denominations would go out into the field, and a preacher would come on horseback and preach to a bunch of people and call for repentance and salvation outside of a church. Like, that was shocking. It was scandalous, right? Revivalist preachers like George Whitefield were run out of town. They were sometimes fined by authorities for preaching the gospel in fields, like outside of churches, these sorts of things. Does that make sense, right? So you get this kind of these old lights versus new lights. Now, without getting much deeper into that, you can kind of see the distinction. And this divide, this split, hits all Protestant denominations in the English-speaking world to some greater or lesser degree. And even some denominations are kind of born out of this split. So it's not quite a denomination yet, but the Methodists, right? Methodism is born out of the First Great Awakening. That's just kind of one example, right? So Charles Wesley is an Anglican. He's one of these new light Anglicans, and eventually his break with the old light Anglicans becomes so severe that he ends up forming essentially kind of what's at first a new Anglican communion, but eventually is a completely new and different church altogether, right? Similarly, Presbyterians, you get one of their early splits during this time, of a few others here and there. So you have not only denominational splits, excuse me, you have family splits, church splits. So you could have a Congregationalist church will split, a new one will form, and it's probably going to be like a New Light Congregationalist church. Does that make sense, right? So while all this is happening, early 1700s to the late 1700s, what about the Baptists, right? So let's get back to the Baptists. What about the Baptists? Well, in some sense, the Baptists are already there, right? Like we got there first. Like Baptists have been talking about the personal experience of salvation, right, from the very beginning, right? Baptists think of Christianity in personal terms because we talk about, again, repentance and belief, right? Public professions of faith before believers' baptism, right? We don't have the theological mechanism. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that Baptists can't be like cultural, like develop a cultural Christianity. Just, again, look at the South since post-World War II and, in the Midwest to some extent. And you'll see that happening there as well. But at least in the colonial period, we don't have the cultural capital to be able to just sit back and do it. So in many ways, Baptists are kind of already evangelical, right? They're already in this New Light camp in some way. Now, but Baptists are never going to pass up a good time for a split. So, what happens? What happens is, you do have, again, remember our history, remember our trajectory. Many Baptist churches are coming out of, or many of them don't just pop up out of thin air, right? They're groups and individuals that are coming out of these Congregationalist churches in New England, or perhaps Anglican churches in the South, or maybe other groups within the middle colonies. And so some of them look and believe and have theological assumptions and presuppositions a lot like Congregationalist and Anglican and other churches, apart from their ecclesiology and their doctrine of salvation and baptism and these sorts of things. And so you do have Baptists that when the Great Awakening breaks out and this revivalism begins to spread, and there's all this excitement and this energy, and for what they see is like the first time a person's faith, a person's Christianity is slowly kind of being untethered by the church, by the authorities of the church. Does that make sense? Like when they look at that, some Baptists, even though they're sympathetic with a more personal understanding of salvation and a more personalized, individualistic understanding of a relationship with Jesus, even though that's why we've always kind of been that, they look at the revivalism and they look at the maybe untethered individualism. They look at expressions of Christianity that are outside of the boundaries of the local church, and they look at that with suspicion and worry and concern. Does that make sense? Right? There's no accountability. There's no scriptural authority. People are out there in the fields, and some of these revival preachers are great, like Whitefield and the Wesleys and others, but some of them are snakes, right? And they're there to just hype up a crowd. I mean, we've never seen that before, right? And so you have many Baptist churches, while sympathetic to much of the First Great Awakening, reject much of the revivalism and reject much of the kind of, we'll say, the spontaneity, if you will, of the Great Awakening. But others embrace it fully. Or what happens with more often, though, is they're actually products of the New Lights themselves. So this is what happens. You over the course of the 1700s, even into the early 1800s, you get two groups of Baptists begin to form. Now, this is kind of like general and particular Baptists back in England. These are not like what we would think of as denominations. These are more like theological trajectories, okay? So you get two groups forming. You have the regular Baptists and the separate Baptists. So regular Baptists are those that are more suspicious of the revivalism. They're suspicious of just kind of like the theological spontaneity. They're suspicious of the untethered kind of spiritual expressions, right? And most of these churches, well, really, honestly, most of these churches, we'll just say most and I'll cover myself, but most of these churches are churches that existed already before the First Great Awakening, right? But then you have churches that are new light breakaways. They're new congregations, new churches, or new preachers. They were new light Congregationalists. They were new light Anglicans. They broke away. They started their own churches. They started, and again, the first step in anyone's journey in becoming a Baptist is to read your Bible. They started reading their Bible, and they began to see, oh, infant baptism is not there. And not only that, they began to come to other understandings within the Baptist tradition. And so many of these kind of breakaway new light Congregationalist and Anglican churches eventually basically become Baptists. But they're not afraid of the revivalism. They're not afraid of this kind of radical individualism and self-expression because they were born from it, for lack of a better term. Does that make sense? So what you begin to have in the 1700s is you have these two groups, these regular Baptists and separate Baptists. Regular Baptists are as close as Baptists get to old lights, whereas separate Baptists come out of these new lights. And so I thought I had more time, but I just realized it's 6 o'clock. But we're going to talk about, probably next week, we'll talk about the big differences between regular Baptists and separate Baptists and how that develops into trajectories that bleed into, really into the 1800s, where you have these, like regular and separate Baptists begin to coalesce and form their own associations, form their own statement of faiths, to where eventually you get kind of what we call the Sandy Creek tradition and the Charleston tradition are kind of born out of these two. And one group is significantly more kind of Calvinistic, more comfortable with something like the Second London Baptist Convention, or Confession rather, and another group is significantly not or less to not Calvinistic, either non-confessional themselves or kind of lightly confessional in some ways. And so you get these kind of two trajectories. So again, this shouldn't be surprising because we've seen these two threads. Remember how when we were talking about the general and particular Baptist all the way back in England, I said these two streams, they get called different names, but they kind of live with Baptists pretty much for their entire history. This is honestly really just kind of, in some ways, a continuation of that. Does that make sense? So next week, we'll dig a little bit more specifically into regular and separate Baptists, and we'll talk about kind of Baptists in the American founding, Isaac Backus and John Leland, and why we have the First Amendment, or why the First Amendment is written the way it is in the U.S. Constitution. You can thank a Baptist. So anyway, that's that. Any questions, thoughts, comments? I really felt like I just started talking like 15 minutes ago, but this is what happens. So, all right, guys. Well, we'll be back next week, and we'll talk about, again, regular and separate Baptists, eventually getting us into Sandy Creek and Charleston Baptists. All right, y'all have a good evening.